Hi, I'm Sarah Hastings Simon, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, where my co-hosts, David Keith, Ed Whittingham, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Albertan and Canadian context. If this is your first time joining us, Energy versus Climate is a live webinar and podcast that drops every other Tuesday. Visit energyversusclimate.substack.com to register for updates and get exclusive access to join our live webinars, ask us questions, and engage with us directly. On today's show, we're discussing hard questions about the transition to carbon-free power in Alberta and worldwide. We'll look at the arguments raised in Planet of the Humans and examine what the movie gets wrong. Now, on to the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second live webinar event from Quarantine Quarters here in Alberta. My name is Ed Whittingham. I'm a clean energy policy and project consultant and a newly minted fellow of the Public Policy Forum. Once again, I'm coming to you from my house in the mountain community of Canmore, Alberta, where I've been sheltering in place pretty much since I stepped off a plane ride back from Ottawa exactly 2 months ago today. I am joined by a couple wonderful co-hosts. Sarah Hastings Simon joins us from her house in Calgary again. She's a former manager of the clean tech practice at McKinsey & Company and now a research fellow at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy. David Keith is our other co-host. He is a former professor at University of Calgary, founder of Carbon Engineering, and now he's a professor at Harvard University in engineering and the Kennedy School. And he splits his time between Cambridge and Canmore. Here's the plan for today's webinar. For the first 30 minutes, David, Sarah, and I, we're gonna have a conversation about the controversial film Planet of the Humans. Then for the last half hour, we're gonna field questions from those of you who have tuned in. We've also put together a couple poll questions to get your take. The twist is we're gonna try using the raise hand function this time. All right, let's get on to Michael Moore and Jeff Gibbs' latest polemic, Planet of the Humans. And the film bills itself, and I'm gonna quote its self-description from YouTube, as a documentary that dares to say what no one else will, that we are losing the battle to stop climate change on planet Earth because we are following leaders who have taken us down the wrong road. If environmentalists have fallen for green illusions that are anything but green, we need a wake-up call to the reality we are about to face, that in the midst of a human-caused extinction event, the environmental movement's answer is to push for techno fixes and band-aids. It's too little, too late. And again, that's how the film bills itself on YouTube. Now, we decided to focus on it for a couple reasons. One is just as a polemic, it works. And its work, proof is in the numbers. It's had 7.5 million views, and it's clearly touched a nerve. And the other reason is that it's raised hard questions about the transitions to carbon-free power, not just here in Alberta, but worldwide. So before we get into dissecting the substance of the film and tackle those hard questions, Sarah, David, I want you to channel your inner Siskel and Ebert. What did you think of the film at a high level, and why has it triggered people so much?
I think the triggering is easy enough. There's a kind of obvious man bites dog. So Michael Moore is a darling of the left, and he's biting the left-wing enviros. So I think it's sort of clear why he got people's attention. And I think the film is filled with inaccuracies. So some of the stuff on, say, claims about life cycle emissions from solar or wind are just plain nonsense, made up. But I also think part of the reason it's got attention is it's poking at some stuff that's right, that some of the some enviros have overclaimed about renewables and swept under the rug some of the big environmental impacts from at least some renewables. And I think what I hope we get into today is the fact that we need to make some clever choices inside there. And we do need to have some of these conversations more, even if Moore's film was a polemic, it does point to some conversations that actually are needed.
So I agree with a lot of what David said. I think part of the reason that it's gotten so much attention is that it actually feeds into sort of a new frontier of the climate change war, if you want. And that is this idea that there are few people left out there who are really saying, climate change isn't real and we don't need to do anything. But there's this new front of, well, I'll admit climate change is real, but it's really hard, or there's nothing that we can do about it, or, the solutions are not magic silver bullets, so we should all throw up our hands and just go home and keep doing what we're always doing. And I think that is, whether or not that's what was intended, I think that the movie feeds into that narrative quite well. And I think that's part of why it's been getting a lot of attention and press from people who want to be continuing to put that narrative forward.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. For me, the film reminds me of that Edward R. Morrow quote, and that is, just because your voice reaches halfway around the world doesn't mean you're any wiser than when your voice reached only to the end of the bar. And for me, it was an hour and 40 minutes of what I'd call an earnest, but still tiresome guy sitting on a bar stool, ranting about what really pisses him off in the world. And I get that, but for me, there just wasn't any kind of conclusion or resolution to it. My wife is Japanese. When we watch films, we'll watch them with the subtitles on. And with the subtitles, you see the music cues. And the music cue that kept popping up was somber music again and again and again. And I think that was really the overall tone of the film. And I've been around depressing environmentalism before, and this was it on steroids. On the plus side, I like any film that tries to expose hyperbole, tries to expose exaggeration and hypocrisy, regardless of the source. It did that to a point. I think we're going to get into where it succeeded, where it failed. As for triggering it, yeah, hey, we all love Michael Moore when he's making anti-gun films that are highly entertaining. We don't like it as much when he makes anti-renewables films. And without realizing that the tactics that he uses for Bowling for Columbine is exactly the same as the tactics that he used for this film. And as a polemic, he's hit it out of the park, if you think about it, given that we and so many others are focusing on the questions that the film raises. So we're going to dive into a poll question for you. And the poll question is, the film has generated a lot of discussion. In particular, it raises many concerns about renewable energy and suggests that renewable energy isn't much better for the planet than fossil fuel-based energy. What do you think? Renewable energy isn't much better for the planet than fossil. It is much better for the planet than fossil. It depends. And it depends, I think, is going to win this race.
Little too easy.
All right. So clearly it is a question of it depends on the type of renewables. At least that's what our audience tell us. Sarah, why don't you crack it open?
So I think a lot gets lost in the it depends, right? I mean, and that's a little bit the problem that I have with these kinds of films and trying to kind of boil everything down to there is a black and white answer. And as long as there's the tiniest bit that keeps it from being better in all case, then we assume that it's actually worse. And so, I mean, yes, there are, every time that we do something, every time that we use energy in the world, it's going to have an impact, right? And so the goal is how do we minimize that impact? One of the things that I think the film doesn't spend enough time on and that doesn't often get enough attention in these discussions is the energy efficiency piece, right? And that's why all energy use has an impact, and so we should be trying to reduce what we're doing as much as possible. That said, I think there is a significant amount of renewable energy opportunities, wind, solar, and others that have a life cycle impacts that are, measurably much, much, much lower by many factors than fossil fuels. And so that, I think, is something that in listening to the dialogue about renewables, particularly in Alberta and in response to this film and before, there seems to be this connection that people are often trying to make of, well, on the one hand, renewables aren't perfect, and so therefore, and there's some sort of strange logic that's going on in there, we should just stick with the fossils or we shouldn't change what we're doing. And that, I think, is really problematic. And being able to separate kind of what level discussion we're having, are we talking at the high level of, generally speaking, this is going to be the better set of solutions or places to be looking, that's sort of one claim to make. And then there's a different claim of, let's get down into the details of which technology we should use and what impact that has, and talk about what are the relative negative impacts as well. But I think that those two conversations are too often mixed, and that's where a lot of that misunderstanding is coming from.
Great. So our results, I'm going to cut it off here. We've got 4% of people saying that renewable energy isn't much better for the planet. We've got 32 saying it is much better for the planet, and 64% saying it depends. Maybe, David, what do you think of these results? And then let's segue into one of the questions that we have. Is renewable energy simply overhyped, or is it oversold?
I think using renewables as a grab bag isn't that helpful. Let me talk about one thing that's been really kind of personal to me, my own research and my own experience getting slagged by the environmental world. So I published one of the very first sort of high profile papers that looked at whether wind power had a climate impact. And that was close to 15 years ago, I guess. And when that paper came out, I had like really, attacks that claimed I was just purely in the pay of the fossil fuel industry, and it was just completely ridiculous and made up, really kind of some wild, over the top attacks. And now, 10 or 15 years later, there's something like 100 papers by lots of groups. There are now more than 10 different studies at US wind sites that clearly show substantial temperature increases as wind power is installed. And you can see plumes of warm air coming off wind turbines. And there's also now real data that shows that this question about kind of atmospheric limit to wind power production that we and others put forward is roughly correct. That doesn't mean, to be absolutely clear, it doesn't mean that wind power is bad. There's, I think, no question wind power is better than, say, coal. But I think that it gave me a sense of how polarized these things are, that even asking the question about what environmental impacts of a big renewable were got you into a lot of hot water. And my view, to kind of cut to, I think is an answer, is that, in fact, most renewables, if you just count the list, are things we really wouldn't want much of, but some of them are things that could solve the whole problem. So there's solar power. There's no reason we couldn't power all of human energy needs, or many times all of human energy needs, on solar using only a percent or so of the land surface, and there's no obvious environmental limit. But that's basically not true for any others. So if you look at hydro, biofuels, tidal, all of those have really quite large environmental footprints, and by some measure, some of them have larger footprints per unit energy than fossil. Wind is kind of the complicated in the middle thing. Clearly, it's better than some renewables, some fossil, but very large scale wind would really have limits and big environmental consequences.
Yeah, and you mentioned that study. So I remember, this was shortly after I started at the Pembina Institute. You came in to present. You claimed off the top that you wanted to hit us upside the head with a big 2x4, which I think you did, talking about that study. But one thing that stood out for me at the time is you said going into that study, and specific to wind, that you thought the environmental benefit to liability ratio would be about 50-1. And coming out, you thought it was more a ratio of about 5-1. So maybe just compare and contrast with solar, a little bit more on solar. Why is solar, you think, a less environmentally impactful form of technology than wind?
It's fundamentally about land footprint. So one way to think about any primary energy source, nuclear power, fossil, whatever, is how much land you need per unit of long-term power production. So you can think about it as watts per square meter. And solar can produce over 10 watts per square meter in real large installations, even counting all the lands and roads and so on. And when you do the math, what that means is you could power all of human civilization, or even several times all, at numbers of order 1% of the land surface. Wind is about a factor of 10 lower power density, between 10 and 20. And so that means you need much more land. To put it in North American terms, if you wanted to make all North American electric power wind, you need to cover a big fraction of the core of continental North America with wind turbines, with real impacts both from the kind of direct land use impacts and from the climate impacts. Biofuels are also kind of less than a watt per square meter, so like wind, but they cover the whole place, whereas wind is just individual turbines with space in between. Hydro depends on the installation, but hydro is also of order like biomass, so really different. So short answer is, one measure is simply how much land you have to take. The other is how much you kind of have to interfere with natural cycles.
Gotcha. One thing, when getting back to the movie, one thing that I thought struck me as part of its flawed starting premises was Gibbs going in saying, listen, is it possible for machines made by industrial civilization to save us from industrial civilization? And is green energy a panacea for everything? And I think what we're clearly saying is, when it comes to energy, there is no free lunch, that there is no zero impact energy. And as soon as we're developing and consuming energy, we are going to have some kind of impact. Whereas Gibbs went in seeming to think that people were promoting renewables as zero impact. I was very influenced early on in my career by a book by a Cambridge professor and physicist who is now unfortunately deceased, David Mackay, called Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. I think it's one of the best books that's ever been written on energy, and it looks at the premise or the question, could you power the UK entirely on sustainable energy? And by sustainable energy, he assumes it's all renewables and no nukes. He does an exhaustive study. He uses an energy equivalency basis, converting everything to kilowatt hours. He looks at plausible measures to reduce demand. And his conclusion in the book was, yes, based on how much renewables you can produce and based on the demand you can expect, the UK could be powered entirely on sustainable energy, renewables. It doesn't violate the laws of physics, and you two physicists would appreciate that. But once you factor in economic and social license constraints, then of course it's implausible. You'd look at converting massive amounts of land in the UK, having shorelines dotted with offshore wind or maxing out tidal, and clearly there would be pushback against that. He goes on to propose what would be a reasonable energy mix for the UK that involves some fossils, involves some nukes, and involves a massive ramp up of renewables, which is what every credible climate scenario is calling for. Not an overall complete replacement, but a massive ramp up.
So there's a couple of things that I would say in response to that. So, I mean, one, I think you captured well with the film that sets up this straw man of like renewables are the magical unicorn. And then, these great filmmakers come in and discover for all us uninformed environmentalists that, oh my gosh, these things have impacts. And like, as if that was some big discovery that we've all been overlooking. So I think that is one of the problems that I have with that kind of analysis. I mean, then I come to David's point and say the wind paper or others. And I think that we too often, and I don't know where to fully lay the blame for this, but this disconnect between asking important scientific questions about how much energy can we get out of different forms of renewable generation or other, and then translating that and the degree to which those findings are translated or used in bad faith by people trying to make arguments for, their own economic reasons to prevent changes in the energy system, for example. I mean, that really is something that is happening to a large degree. And so I think that often, and I also wouldn't want to paint environmentalists with a single brush, but when people are sort of getting concerned about a specific scientific finding, it's not necessarily in the light of, that this is wrong from a scientific perspective,
right.
But it's that we're somehow in society, we have this like broken link between that academic world and the world of popular understanding of the research piece. And I mean, I think we're seeing that play out, again, actually, even in the pandemic that we're in the midst of now, where people are sort of, that the doctors were saying one thing and now they're saying something else. And therefore, that shows that scientists don't know anything, as opposed to that being the way that science happens. And so that's, I think, an important piece here. And then similarly, then we talk about different fuel sources with limitations. I mean, even within, say, biomass, which I know we're going to, I think, get to later, but there are good specific use cases for it, right? If you have waste wood located somewhere where it's otherwise going to be decaying and releasing methane, it may make a lot of sense to burn that and produce power rather than let it decay. And that doesn't mean that we should try to power the world on biomass, but it also doesn't mean that that's, a bad use of that in that specific case. And so that's this whole piece that ends up getting lost, I think, in a lot of the discussion that's going on, both in this film and what I hear elsewhere about renewables being overhyped.
Agreed. I mean, just for 1 second, in fairness to people who were critiquing our work, there were many people who said, yeah, maybe you're scientifically right, but you don't understand, David, this will be exploited against wind power by the fossil fuel industry, which is certainly true. On the other hand, we need to find some middle ground where we can actually do the analysis, because if we think about really large-scale transition to carbon-free, which we have to do if we want a stable climate, we must go all the way to carbon-free. You actually do have to make choices, and governments have to decide where the flow of money is, and it really does matter to think about choices between funding, say, hydro development or solar or wind or nuclear.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it can't be that we say, well, therefore we can't, do that science because somebody might misuse it. But I think we need some other solution for that.
Well, let's pick up where we almost left off the last webinar. So are the facts around renewables being misconstrued by people? And are they being misconstrued by environmental groups or environmentalists? Because Gibbs and Moore take a hard run, and that some people I know, like Mike Bruin, the head of the Sierra Club, he takes a run at Bruce Nilles, the head of the NCOAL program, the Beyond Coal program of the Sierra Club. So David, you were sort of getting there in our last webinar. Do you think environmentalists are overhyping or misconstruing the benefits? And if they are, does the end in this case not justify the means?
Some of them certainly are. I mean, it's a big difference. When you invited me into Pembina so long ago to hit you with a 2x4, the biggest way I did that was biofuels, because I found something on the Pembina website that was really positive about biofuels. And I said, listen, Britain became dominantly fossil powered in late 1700s because they basically used all the biofuels they were in that society. And I tried to say like what it would really mean to do large scale biofuels. So there's no question there are some people in the environmental community overhyping. I think the bigger problem is there's a much larger section of the environmental community that wants to believe that renewables are now so cheap and economic that the only reason they're not just taking over the marketplace is corruption and lobbying from fossil fuel industry buying politicians. And I feel like that doesn't see the world the way it really is. There clearly are some corruption, and no question people in the fossil fuel industry are spending their money to buy politicians. That's happening, but it's not as if renewables are now cheap enough that if you just let free market go, we'd magically decarbonize.
Yeah. Sarah, I mean, from your time at Pembina, what are your thoughts?
So I don't know whether you call it hype or understanding, but I mean, I would stand behind the claim that in Alberta, the potential for renewables is underappreciated and under-realized, right? And one just anecdotal example. So there's the story of when the price announcement for the renewable energy procurement for wind was announced in Calgary a couple of years back now, that there was audible gasps in the room at the price of whatever it was, I think $37 a megawatt hour at the time, which was a price that was basically, if you had looked up previous power purchase agreements that had transacted, in the US, and you did the exchange rate between the US dollar and took off the PTC, was exactly the price that people had been buying renewables at.
Yeah.
And yet somehow this was like big news to a large group of people who were not just a random person from the street, but people that were in the electricity sector. And so I think that really struck me. And I think that's part of the problem. So with the facts in the film is that a lot of them were, 5-10 years old, but in an industry that's moving incredibly quickly and seeing, cost reductions and efficiency increases that are quite dramatic. So I think that there is a tendency for many to undervalue or underappreciate the real, potential that renewables can bring in terms of that price piece. And while I don't think that I don't think that the slowdown, say, of deployment of renewables is always nefarious or sort of like corruption based. I mean, there are a lot of kind of lock-in or mechanisms that are preventing the deployment of even more renewables at a larger scale in both we look across Canada, so in Alberta in a market-based, but also very much in the regulated utilities as well, where you have decision makers who are just they lack incentives to kind of do things differently than they've already done them before. So I think that is also tends to be underappreciated.
My hope, though, you're saying renewables, and my hope would be to mostly cross that word out. After all, renewables are technically the solution to an energy supply problem, which we don't have. What we have is a carbon in the atmosphere problem. So let's focus on low carbon. And again, I think there's been unbelievable, just amazing improvement, especially in solar, but also in wind, just stunning. And I was wrong about the pace, just enormous. And that makes a bunch of the stuff on life cycle that Moore said completely wrong. But that's solar and wind. It's not renewables generally. There's been no big improvement in hydro, which is mostly pretty terrible. Canada's building a ridiculously expensive Site C in BC for no obvious reason. There's been no big improvement in biofuels. A bunch of the other small renewables, same thing. So I think it's really important to say solar and wind.
Yeah, that's fair. It's an incorrect shorthand that I think gets used.
Yeah, and I would agree. I mean, just Site C, I think it's an environmental and an archaeological catastrophe that shouldn't be built. And we have very limited capacity for large-scale hydro left in the country. But on the renewables question, I was in this position at Pembina working on the policy side, trying to convince policymakers. Now some of the work I do is on the project side and on the finance side. From my experiences, in spite of what the film suggests, I don't think we need to convince policymakers of the need for a ramp up in the deployment of renewables. We really need to convince them in some of the mechanisms to facilitate that. And one of the mechanisms is just on the financing side. If we look right now with where we are with COVID recovery, we're going to go through a once in a generation injection investment in the economy. And I think there is still a role for policymakers, not through regulation, but just through some of the public financing mechanisms that we have to incent greater deployment of renewables that would happen otherwise, even in spite of now the relative cheapness. And especially now, given that in places, a lot of the industrial demand has been weakened, and it's that much harder for developers to develop their projects. On the hyperbole, let's face it, we're in a hyper-polarized environment. There's some hyperbole on both sides. I think that's just part of it. We have to put on our rain jackets. All three of us have been publicly attacked in various ways, shapes, and forms, and movies like this just evidence that it's only going to continue. Let's talk just a couple minutes on this question of Alberta and Albertans' interests and concerns. This film really takes a run at renewables and the environmental impacts. What do Albertans care about when it comes to renewables? Sarah, you've been working on this a long time. What do they care about? Is the environment top of mind when they think about renewables?
I don't think it's top of mind. I mean, I think I think there's a couple of different groups and they care about different things, right? So I think there are Albertans that genuinely care about the land impacts of renewables. And there are plenty of environmental not-for-profits that are working on those questions, how to think about siting renewables responsibly, things like that. I think that there are a different set of people that have other concerns and that sometimes bring forward those environmental concerns because they think they're more palatable than the other reasons. One of the things that I find, frustrating maybe really, is that Albertans haven't embraced renewables as much as, say, their counterparts in, Texas or in the Midwest in the US, where you have quite conservative regions that have really seen the economic benefits, the job benefits of renewables. And again, it's not a panacea. It's not going to employ the entire oil sands workforce. I don't want to be accused of overhyping. But for whatever reason, there has been more resistance, and I think they're seen as more of sort of you're either on the fossil side or you're on the wind and solar side, and that I think is unfortunate.
Yeah,
David, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, overhype is everywhere. It's to be expected. That's not the issue. I think that part of what's happened, I mean, maybe to circle back to something I worked on earlier, which is CO2 capture and storage, which also has suffered from a hype cycle. And I think part of what happened is that CO2 capture and storage for electricity got eclipsed by the fact that wind and solar were just beating it in the near term. I think that will start to shift as we get further down the curve and squeeze more emissions out of the electric sector, and then it gets harder to get the last. And so we get to industrial sources, it's different. But there's no question that just wind and solar got really cheap.
Yep. On this question of concerns, I've spent a lot of time in communities now, and I think of spending time in Hanna, Alberta in the last couple of years. And Hanna, some of you might know it as the home of Nickelback, and it is now in the process of trying to diversify its economy beyond coal mining, coal-fired electricity, and Nickelback. And it considered a large-scale 120 megawatt solar project. And by far, rather than the concerns about being the environment, like what's raised in Planet of the Human, by far the concerns were around local economic benefits. That was the primary concern. Are you going to do this development in a way that doesn't leave us behind, that doesn't involve big companies, energy companies swooping in developing it when we get nothing? The second concern that was really surprising was end-of-life remediation, and that they were really interested. And I think this comes from years of having to deal with abandoned oil and gas wells. You tell us it's a 25 or 35-year life project. At the end, are we going to be left with a bunch of steel, glass, and wires on our land that we're going to have to remediate ourselves instead of you coming in and cleaning up after yourselves. The environment, the overall impact, whether it's low emission or not, was way down the list in terms of a concern.
Totally agreed. Let's take questions.
All right. There are a couple questions around storage. David, this one is to you. You've discussed the potential impact of different types of renewable generation across technologies. What are your comments on battery storage? What are your views on the life cycle impacts of battery storage compared to a potential greater net benefit of storage plus renewable generation?
Not sure I understand the last part of that question. I mean, storage is principally needed to manage intermittency of renewables. Right now, at current costs, battery storage is very, very far away from really managing the seasonal and sort of even the full diurnal cycle of intermittent wind and solar. So maybe battery storage will get there, but my personal guess is that it won't, that we'll find other things that do it. To get a little more local, the biggest actual installations of large-scale electric storage in the world and the cheapest are still, even today, pumped hydro. And there are people building pumped hydro around the world. It's not sexy, it doesn't get any press. It's not like new battery companies, but it's actually happening, and the costs are relatively good. And if you think local to Alberta, Alberta has very good wind resource and very good solar resource, and British Columbia has a huge hydro resource, which can be used as a kind of battery. And if you think about how you actually decarbonize Alberta and BC together, part of the answer, much more than spending money on local battery installations, is probably tighter integration. So we build out extra, sort of more than Alberta needs, wind, let's say, and we manage the intermittency using the hydro in BC. But that requires a real level of joint planning and more integration.
Yeah, and actually on that one, I mean, that's something that Blake Schaefer and we wrote a piece about a little while back, the BC Alberta tie line potential. And I think there you get some interesting politics that come into it, right? Because basically it is beneficial for, Alberta writ large to be able to build out our wind resource and send power to BC and to use BC as a battery. It is not beneficial if you are someone who's built or owns a lot of natural gas assets that would otherwise be competing to provide power at peak times in Alberta. And so what's happened somehow is that concern for one group of people within the province has been put forward as this would be, bad for Alberta overall. And I think that's a big part of the reason that you don't see projects like that going forward. And so making sure that we're clear about, what is the net benefit? And then if there are, losers, how do we fairly compensate people if we're going to make big investments like that, I think is the way to solve that kind of thing.
Okay. We're gonna try a live question right now. So we've got, forgive me if I butcher your name, Jagos Radovic, who has a question around nuclear.
Hi everyone. Thanks for great webinar and the past one too. So yeah, my question is with all the constraints that we discussed so far and the kind of development of nuclear technologies in past few decades and uranium resources that Canada has, is there a sensible is discussing nuclear going forward a sensible idea in your opinion?
I'll have a go at that. So in the very long run, if I think about how we're decarbonizing the world, I feel like nuclear has to be on the table. I don't think we have to do it. I think you could decarbonize the world with solar, but nuclear has this low land footprint and it's hugely scalable. So there's lots of long-term reasons to take it seriously. But in practice, in the near term, it just seems close to hopeless. Nuclear power plant builds all over the world, even in Asia, are going way over time and way over budget. And the situation isn't good. To give you a Canadian story, I was on a very senior Canadian panel reporting to the Minister of Environment. This is more than 10 years ago, I guess. And there were about 10 of us. We had meetings around the country. And we had meetings with people at AECL and CANDU. And I came into this with somebody with a physics background, with some kind of pro-nuclear leanings and kind of proud of what we've done in Canada. And I'm not going to put this politely. They lied, pure and simple. And we caught them. And it made me, the level of internal self-deception around the current and the advanced CANDU is just stunning. They basically assumed that nobody in the audience, this audience of us, could go check the facts, and they just tried to BS their way through it. And it left me thinking that the right answer is just to pull the plug. that Canada should cut off government spending to those programs because they're just burning money.
I'm going to jump in, Sarah. I'm just thinking as a guest, maybe we have John Gorman on. He's the head of the Canadian Nuclear Association. He used to run the Canadian Solar Industry Association. So operating in those two sectors, I think you'd have a really interesting perspective. I look at nuclear and I think of like nuclear fusion, which is always promised, but no matter where you are in history, it's always 10 to 15 years away. It's a long lead time technology. It's capital intensive. The waste remains an intractable problem, and you need state level insurance to actually insure it. So I think where we have nuclear already, it's fine, not advocating that you take it offline. France has found a way to power most of its electricity grid safely with nuclear. But I think there are other sources that are cheaper, that are less risky, that we should move ahead with instead of diverting too much time and energy down the nuclear rabbit hole.
So let me say one positive nuclear thing. I mean, I think it's very hard to get your mind around the risks. The risk of weapons proliferation is a really separate one. It's hard to think about. But the most exposed couple of workers at Fukushima who took the highest personal risk and walked into the buildings got about half a sievert, which is equivalent to a diet change. It changes your cancer risk over 30 years by 0.5% or so. So it's like a diet change. And people outside the plant basically had no risk at all. The big risk it was the stress of people being evacuated, not because of the actual risk, because of the evacuation. So the real risks are massively overstated compared to what's technically true. I mean, in that same Japanese situation, there was a refinery fire in Tokyo that almost certainly killed more people by air pollution than Fukushima did by radiation. But that just is not the way people think about it, and the costs are very high. So at this point, we're just stuck.
On the nuclear fusion, and then also I think that next gen, the small nuclear reactors are worth talking about. So I mean, nuclear fusion, I wrote my college entrance essay on what the world would be like if we had nuclear fusion, and indeed it's always 5 to 10 years away. That said, I mean, I think there are still serious projects ongoing, including in Canada, and there are, you look at the ability, the computing power and ability we have to better control systems. I think there is still a reasonable, belief that you might be able to make that one work. Similarly, I think that some of the next gen, the small modular reactors, also really interesting potential. All of these technologies that are still under development, but I think have a really interesting potential also in producing some of the, decarbonizing some of the industrial processes potentially in the long run as well too. And so I see them, I think we need a lot of continue to work on a number of parallel solutions. And so it's not about, do we install wind and solar, or do we work on nuclear, as I think too often the discussion gets boiled down to. We have so many of the technologies that we need to decarbonize our electricity system to a very high level without it being prohibitively expensive or difficult. And so that is something that we need to be going full speed ahead on, at the same time that we need to be investing in a range of technology solutions that's going to decarbonize the rest when we get there. And so that's where, that's kind of where I land on that. I agree with David and Ed on the large scale nuclear first gen type and even second in some cases. I think we've seen how those work, and that's not likely to move a lot further. But I think it has a role to play. It just too often is put forward as this war between the wind and solar and nuclear that it's just silly.
Yep. So we've got a question here around geothermal. I know we touched upon this in the last webinar, but let's make it specific to Alberta. The question is, what about geothermal? In Alberta, geothermal can help utilize oil and gas infrastructure while providing reliable, clean energy. And it's been in the news recently. It's been in the news around, can we take Alberta drilling expertise and reapply that to enhance deep geothermal and keep jobs? So maybe David, because you touched upon this last time, does it work?
It's clearly technically possible. No question that the energy's there and it's technically possible to exploit it. I think it's worth looking at more. I don't know well enough, but to the extent that I and others have looked, I think there are some real barriers. One of them is back to the energy density barrier. So the actual amount of net energy you get out of a well during its lifetime for most of the ways that geothermal works are surprisingly small. And so you then have to net out the impacts on the surface of doing the well and the impacts from water quality that can come from doing those wells against the energy production. And the fact that you've got relatively low-grade heat coming out that you either have to use as low-grade heat or find a way to generate power from, I think it's a kind of fundamental barrier that makes it less attractive than you might think. So I guess if I had to bet, like if I was betting money, my bet is geothermal never ends up contributing much. The reality is solar just keeps getting cheaper. There's no reason to stop it. Energy density is high. We know how to scale projects. I think there will be some locations. Obviously, there's places like Iceland where geothermal is fantastic. And there will be some places, maybe some of this stuff in Alberta, using deep wells or some clever ideas where you combine it with some kind of resource like lithium extraction. There certainly are ideas that will work at the margins. But if you ask me to guess, is geothermal going to be a significant part of global energy mix? I think it's pretty unlikely.
Yeah, I think I see the sort of a race in a sense, right, between wind and solar build out coupled with energy storage, so battery, but also other new types, long duration heat storage and others, transmission lines, and then things like the third gen nuclear and geothermal. And so those are all ways of solving this problem of how do we generate low carbon power when we need it. And they're all going to follow their own technology development trajectory. And I do think, like you're saying, David, I think there's a difference between asking kind of globally what's going to win out and locally what can. And so I do think that there's opportunities in Alberta to take some of, say, the wells that we have existing and to repurpose some of our workforce. So I do see potential there. I think that there's more that needs to be done to, similar to the renewable energy program that helped kind of kickstart wind and solar in the province again by providing the right kind of, project and financing mechanisms to allow those to go forward. I think without that, it will be very hard to do so. And I think we need to be realistic about the size, right? This is, again, it's not going to be the solution to our whole well liability crisis. It's not going to be the solution to, reemploying all of our drilling engineers. But I think it has it has a role to play as a piece of that.
Yeah, like you're getting to. Maybe we'll have time to get back to biomass, because I agree. I think biomass has a niche role to play, and I'd like to talk a bit about that niche. But before then, so storage is another theme, and we have Mariam MK. If you're still on, you've got a storage-related question.
Okay, thanks very much for the opportunity to ask this question. So I understand that battery storage, in terms of hydro, that's going to be the cheapest opportunity. But what we're talking about here is about the larger scale. And therefore, yes, pumped hydro is going to be the best. But how about the smaller scale or the remote area? We need to consider other contributors to the emissions rather than just larger scale pumped hydro. What are your thoughts on battery storage for smaller scale power generation units?
My view is that, so it'd be interesting to hear different things. So very tiny fraction of global energy use is truly off-grid. And people often, one of the classic questions that I ask for students, for experts is what is the efficiency of electric grid? What fraction of power is lost? And in general, even elite expert audiences get it substantially wrong. People forget that the electric grids are extraordinarily efficient. So the US electric grid loses about 6%. So it's about 94% efficient, and that's pretty typical. So basically, to rounding errors, it's perfect. And what that means is there's no benefit to small scale in general, because in general, it turns out that the local operating costs mean that you get benefits from scale. Obviously, small scale off-grid is a different case, but off-grid is so tiny that it's not a big contributor to emissions. So I think, except for some particular cases around transmission constraints, I don't see why somehow batteries make sense at small scale if they don't make sense at big scale for really decarbonizing energy systems.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting modeling, right? So Chris Clack and others have shown really the power of transmission in decarbonizing North America, say, an integrated grid brings a lot. I think that we're also really only at the beginning of development of this large scale energy storage. And so there are some different exciting opportunities to look at. Certainly, even lithium ion batteries, if you think about it, are really quite new, right? I mean, I'm trying to remember the exact date, but we're talking like a couple of decades, not 50, 100 years. So I think that there's scope for significant progress in both kind of that type of battery technology. But then also, the race, I think, is just sort of starting with some of the large scale heat storage type technologies. I think those are really interesting, especially when you're talking about retrofitting grids that have, existing large fossil plants on them, the extent to which you could replace or kind of sub in, basically a large heat storage that can be much more seasonal. There's some interesting stuff there. So I think there's a lot of kind of new technologies that are still coming and that are, again, I don't think it's a matter of, okay, we got to figure out all the storage and then we start building out the renewables. It's a bit of like building I'm going to get the analogy wrong, but you're sort of like building as you're running the plane. And when we get there, I have a lot of faith that the storage technology is kind of coming along with there too, because when you have the market there and you don't have a fundamentally impossible physics problem to solve, I think we will figure it out.
I really agree with that.
So what about, if we're talking about storage and hydrogen is popping up in the chat, what about the links? What is the potential of the hydrogen economy in Alberta? There are sort of some really interesting work that's underway. There's an outfit out of, originally came out of the U of C, your old schools, or current school, called the Transition Accelerator, that is making a big push among senior policymakers on a hydrogen economy. And if you look at it, there's the opportunity for decarbonization. You can use wind and solar to make electricity and hydrogen. And when renewables aren't available, you can then back out that hydrogen to make power. And it plays to the existing skill set that Alberta has. So you've got a lot of people locally getting excited about it, and in the context of stimulative spending that is coming up. So back to you. What do you think of hydrogen, and especially when it couples with storage for electricity grids?
I think that effort of the Transition Accelerator led by Dave Lozelle is really terrific. I take hydrogen really seriously. And I think this idea of Alberta starting with fossil fuel hydrogen with CCS, so that's carbon neutral hydrogen, but starting with fossil, with the idea that it develops a technological ability that may be used for solar or wind hydrogen later, or nuclear, I think is credible and sensible. The one place where I would see it slightly differently is I don't think it will be used significantly for electricity storage. That is, I don't think you go electricity, hydrogen, and back to electricity very much. The round trip efficiency is just too lousy. I think it's really, hydrogen's useful for decarbonizing the non-electric parts of the energy system, transportation or heavy industry.
I think there's also some interesting work being done on direct hydrogen production as well, directly from the resource in Alberta, which is an interesting one to watch as well too. What comes to mind as we're going through these lists of technologies, and I'm excited about all of them. I think it's important to distinguish between that. Doesn't mean that I believe that all of them are ultimately going to be successful, right? And a number of them are actually sort of, as I was saying, I guess you could add hydrogen in there. A number of them are sort of in a race against each other, right? And so what I think that we need is an innovation system that recognizes that, right? And so I'll go back to the example of solar photovoltaic, which we've been, praising. And if you go back about 10 years ago, it had a pretty serious competitor in solar thermal technology, right? So people remember those giant near sort of alien looking fields with the molten salt or whatever heat carrier. And there were two technologies that at the time were pretty neck and neck, and experts said like both could be great. And then we play the tape forward, and solar PV benefited very much from some adjacent technology development and the use of silicon and the computer kind of industry running alongside. But I think that's a great example of the way that technology development happens. And so it's not that you have experts who sit here and say, well, this is the right one and we should throw that one out, but it's how do we create the system that's going to sort of let them play forward and be funding them at the right amounts of money so that they have enough to keep going, but then also be ready to call it and say, okay, look, sorry, it's not happening for you, technology, and we're gonna move our funding over there. So I think that's a key way as we think about all of these technologies that we've been talking about.
Well, I'd love to talk about that. Maybe that's a topic for a future webinar, because Alberta used to invest heavily in innovation, including government investment. And you look at Alberta Innovates, brought up a very bright light from Austin, Texas, which could be a model for Alberta on how to do transition well, to run Alberta Innovates, and now we've gutted the funding. So we've gone from this, and under a political ideology that it's not really government's role to incent innovation, it is the private sector's role. I'm going to park that because we could spend a whole hour on that. I think we have time for one more question, and we're going to bring in someone live. So Santosh Shankar has a really interesting question that gets to some of the work you've done with carbon engineering, David. All right, over to you.
Hey, great. Thank you. A very interesting discussion. I really enjoyed it. And I have seen the movie and does seem to have a very cynical note to it. But my question here is essentially on, we discuss a lot on renewables, batteries, and I think agree to a large extent to a lot of things that was said in this call. But there are going to be continued reliance on typical liquid-based hydrocarbon fuels in the future, be it aviation or shipping or long haul freight, or even things like iron and steel industry, where you need high temperatures for processing material productions, for example. So what is your view on the need where you still see that you need these high density energy molecules in the form, and today there is deriving them from fossil is perhaps the most economic option. Things like power to liquids or power to gas, of taking electrons and making them out of molecules eventually, as what carbon engineering also has done in the past. These are still very commercially still far off, say at least 10 years far off. So what's the view with the panelists here on these kind of applications?
I think we won't electrify everything. So basically, electricity will win where it can, but there will be significant sectors of the economy I don't see us ever electrifying. So even once we get to a purely carbon neutral economy, I think there will be significant sectors where we need high energy density liquid fuels. So most obviously, long range aircraft, I just cannot conceive of them being electric. Hydrogen, maybe, but not electric. And I think there's other parts of the long run freight infrastructure that are very hard to electrify. And there are some parts of the industrial infrastructure that are hard to electrify. So I think those will stay with fuels. And the issue is, how do we make those fuels in a carbon neutral way? And I think no question that the energy source then starts as being solar or nuclear, in my view, in the long run. Then you go to hydrogen probably. And then what do? Maybe use hydrogen directly, but the other thing you do is you make artificial fuels. So you can do hydrogen plus CO2 going to fuels using pretty conventional gas to liquids technologies. Actually, that's what carbon engineering proposes to do. But it's also possible to actually start with biomass waste and gasify it and use that carbon that's then therefore carbon that came from the atmosphere and make it go to fuels. But I think the answer is there will be synthetic liquid fuels, I think synthetic hydrocarbons, that we will need in the long run, because there will be places where electricity just can't win.
I agree completely. And I think an important piece of that statement is the distinction between let's try to apply CCU or CCUS to everything versus let's figure out what we can, easily or somewhat easily electrify and then find its role elsewhere. And I think that there has been in the past, and where people criticize, maybe from the environmental movement, carbon capture and storage, is when it's been used or put forward as a sort of justification for not making changes to the underlying energy system as a whole. And again, that's probably another place where hyperbole exists on both sides and people are too negative on it. But I think that's the kernel of truth in that negativity. But again, I guess the message we have is that there's not a lot of interesting things to say in this sort of hyper polarized everything is good or everything is bad. So we're probably not going to become the next big hit on the internet that everybody's discussing, I guess, if we're not going the Michael Moore style. But that's, I think, where the truth on this one lies.
We'll try. Maybe we got to get better at being polemicists. And just quickly, for me, I agree. There are parts of the transportation system that are really hard to electrify. Personal mobility is not one of them. We can do that. I think hydrogen has tremendous applicability. I think it could involved in a project building a new passenger rail line from Calgary Airport to Banff. We wanted to run on hydrogen fuel cell engines. And already you've got trucks running between Calgary and Edmonton that are powered on hydrogen. I'm also excited around making synthetic fuels from atmospheric CO2. And that's what you started, David. And I know that two levels of government are excited about its applicability in the industrial heartland as well in Alberta. But without question, because of energy density limits, we're still going to need hydrocarbon-based liquid fuel for some time. Okay, we're at the top of the hour. So thanks, everyone. It's been a fun hour. We'll see you in a couple of weeks' time.
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Wojnarowski. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.substack.com. Interact with us live every other week, and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen.